Life is like a high-stakes performance staged 60 stories above the restless city. In the glittering world of Manhattan's upper echelon, where fortunes are minted and reputations can be demolished in a single evening. Power here is currency, measured not only in billions, but in the effortless cruelty of those who wield it. For Elena Cruz, a 24-year-old waitress standing at the edges of this world, value was measured differently. It was counted in aching double shifts, in the clink of tips gathered dollar by dollar, in the weight of responsibility that pressed against her narrow shoulders every time she returned home to the small apartment she shared with her younger brother, Gabriel. The party invitations courting through this city promised opulence, music, laughter, and excess. But there was always a crueler undercurrent beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the sparkle of diamonds. The powerful entertained themselves by toying with those who served them, measuring human worth by how easily it could be bought, bent, or broken. Elena had long ago learned to slip through that glittering gauntlet unseen, smile politely while remaining invisible, and keep her head down and her heart armored. Anonymity was a shield. Invisibility, her protection. Yet shields sometimes fracture, and even the strongest invisibility can be pierced when the wrong eyes decide to look too closely. Elena was destined to be more than a shadow that night in Manhattan. The law of the elite was about to test her, to strip her bare before a room of strangers who carried power like a weapon. She would not only endure it, she would transform it into something no one in that room could have anticipated. Ultimately, the world that thrived on humiliation and spectacle would be silenced by the voice it tried to erase. She had always known the city spoke in symphonies. Its rhythms and cadences shaped her days, even when she pretended not to hear them. The percussion of the subway roaring below, the clash of voices in crowded diners, the staccato strikes of construction hammers. But the melodies, the lyrical strands that once ran through her veins had been buried beneath years of grief, and 6 years of silence had muted her, transforming what was once brilliance into anonymity. Now, as she carried trays through a cathedral of glass and steel where titans of finance congratulated themselves with rare champagne, she believed she was just another instrument of service in someone else's orchestration. Elena could not yet see that this evening, with its cruel master of ceremonies and watching crowd, would become the stage she had never wanted but always belonged to. In this place where wealth insulated cruelty and indulgence justified humiliation, she would be forced to choose between pride and survival, silence and song. And her choice, though wrung from her in the harshest of ways, would strike like a thunderclap through a room unaccustomed to truth. Above the city's restless sprawl, beneath chandeliers dripping crystal light, a man who believed himself untouchable would seek to turn her into a spectacle. He would measure her value in bills peeled from a golden clip, in the delight of watching a prodigy reduced to a party trick. But Elena's worth was not his to define. The law of the elite demanded obedience, but her soul demanded defiance. This story begins not with applause, but with dismissal. It starts not with reverence, but with scorn. Elena was the ghost with the tray, the nameless girl in black and white uniform, a vessel for someone else's pleasure. She had chosen to hide behind that mask because it was safer than confronting what she had lost. Yet fate would strip away her cover in the form of cruel curiosity and bitter recognition. The night would force her to return to the very thing she had buried, to touch the keys that once promised her the world but now felt like the edge of a knife. The vast and merciless city looked small from the windows of La Astra, but the decisions made there, the humiliations delivered and endured, would ripple far beyond its gilded walls. Elena Cruz, an anonymous waitress, forgotten prodigy, and grieving sister, was about to remind an entire room and herself that music was not meant to be purchased, paraded, or mocked. It was meant to be lived, survived, or claimed. And when the first note came, when silence gave way to sound, nothing in that glittering room would ever be the same again. Elena Cruz moved through the glittering dining hall of La Ostra with the same detached precision she had cultivated over years of service. Her smile was polite, practiced, and empty of warmth. She carried flutes of champagne with an elegance that belied her exhaustion, weaving between tables of men and women who scarcely noticed her existence. To them, she was part of the decor, a moving fixture with a tray, the ghost of someone else's comfort. She preferred it that way. Invisibility meant safety, and safety was all she could afford. But invisibility was not always her natural state. There had been a time when every eye turned to follow her, when silence fell the instant her small fingers touched ivory keys. She had once commanded concert halls and conservatories, her brilliance undeniable, her path to greatness certain. That was before the accident, before grief cut her life into two distinct halves. The before and the after. The before had been drenched in light and melody. Her father, a passionate music teacher, had filled their home with laughter and scales. And her mother, a former concert violinist, had woven harmonies into the fabric of their days. Elena had been their prodigy, their miracle child whose small hands carried the weight of entire symphonies. At 4, she stumbled upon her first piano keys. At 10, she bent Chopin to her will. At 16, she stood at the pinnacle of youthful brilliance, the youngest winner of an international piano competition. Professors called her once in a generation, and Juilliard was no longer a dream, but an inevitability. Her future stretched out like a blinding crescendo, promising stages, ovations, and a life devoted to music. Then came the silence. A rain-slicked highway, a careless truck driver, the shriek of tires. Her parents' lives ended instantly, leaving Elena and her younger brother Gabriel to face a world suddenly colder, harsher, and unrelenting. She had been spared by accident, homesick with the flu while Gabriel had been away at a friend's house. Their survival felt like theft, and the piano in their living room became not an instrument but a tombstone. The weight of grief carved a wall between her and the music. Each key was no longer a note, but a blade that cut into the raw wound of memory. She tried once. She sat before the Steinway that had once been her companion and placed her hands upon its shining ivory. The sound that came out was pure panic, her breath seizing, her chest tightening until her vision blurred. The music had abandoned her, or perhaps she had abandoned it. Either way, the silence became absolute. She kept the piano when she sold their house to pay off debts. It was irrational and foolish, but she could not let go of the last remnant of her parents' world. They had spent a fortune to bring it to life, so she spent one to keep it, hauling it into the cramped living room of their 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. Covered now with a dust sheet, it loomed like a ghost she dared not face, occupying more space than they could afford physically and emotionally. At 18, Elena became Gabriel's legal guardian. College and Juilliard evaporated into impossibility. Her life became double shifts at restaurants, chasing rent, stacking bills, and sacrificing sleep. Her hands, once envied for their grace, hardened into survival tools. Calloused, nicked, and weary, they could carry 4 plates at once, but had forgotten the language of Rachmaninoff. She told herself she did not miss it, that the dream had been buried with her parents, but at night, when exhaustion blurred into insomnia, she sometimes heard phantom notes in the silence, whispers of a life that had been hers and was no more. Gabriel was her reason. At 16, he was lanky, brilliant, and filled with an artistic fire of his own. His gift was not sound, but sight, and he poured it into canvases that captured the grit and beauty of the city with startling ferocity. To Elena, he was the living continuation of their family's artistry, the hope she refused to let the world extinguish. She worked herself to the bone so he would never feel the crushing compromise she endured. But destiny is cruel in its timing. The Rhode Island School of Design letter sat on their small kitchen table, a promise and a threat. Gabriel had been accepted into a prestigious summer program, a direct path to his future, but it came with a $10,000 price tag due in 3 weeks. A number so absurdly out of reach it could have been $1 million. Elena lied when she tucked it away, told him it was fine, told herself she would find a way. But the truth was relentless. Gabriel's dream would be sacrificed on the altar of survival without a miracle, just as hers had been. She glanced at the hulking shadow of the piano in their living room. Gabriel had never heard her play it. He had only ever seen her eyes darken when the subject arose. He once suggested she could use it again, perhaps as a way forward. Her voice had been sharp, final. That was not an option. The piano was her prison, not her freedom. And yet, beneath the surface, her story had not ended. The silence was not permanent. It was waiting, gathering. And one night, high above the city, in the glittering cage of Lastra, the silence would be broken, transformed into a storm that no one present would ever forget. Elena Cruz, the ghost of a prodigy, would soon be called into the light once more. The night of the gala arrived, draped in luxury and arrogance. From the street below, Lastra's 60-floor tower glowed like a beacon, its crystalline windows reflecting the restless heartbeat of Manhattan. Limousines lined the curb, drivers stepping out to open doors as figures wrapped in couture gowns and tailored suits emerged, dripping with diamonds and entitlement. Inside, the restaurant transformed into a palace of wealth, every chandelier blazing, every polished surface reflecting the vanity of those who walked its marble floors. Elena moved through the preparations with her head lowered and her hands steady, her tray balanced as if it were an extension of her body. The staff had been briefed, their manager's face tight with fear. This was not just another party. It was an evening for Dorian Blackwell, the heir to a logistics empire whose name carried fortune and ruin. Known for his charm as much as for his cruelty, Dorian thrived on spectacle. He was not simply rich, he was powerful and enjoyed wielding that power like a blade. The rule was clear: be invisible. Don't make mistakes. Don't attract his attention. Elena had lived in shadows. She thought she could manage invisibility for one more evening. But fate has little interest in human plans. The first guests trickled in, their laughter sharp and brittle, like glass about to shatter. Soon, the room swelled with people who lived as if the city belonged to them. Servers moved like ghosts, weaving between jewels and bespoke tuxedos. Elena offered flutes of champagne and tiny towers of caviar on delicate plates. Her face was expressionless, her mask perfected after years of service. But when her eyes drifted across the room, they caught him. Dorian Blackwell stood in the center of it all, a predator disguised in silk. His Tom Ford suit clung to him like armor, dark and severe, a perfect counterpoint to the glittering silver dress of the woman clinging to his arm. Cassandra Vale, his fiancée, was a figure sculpted out of ice, her beauty immaculate, her posture flawless. Her hair was pulled so tight it seemed to sharpen the edges of her face, but her smile never touched her eyes. Together, they looked like royalty presiding over a court of worshipful subjects. Dorian didn't just occupy the room, he owned it. Every laugh was calibrated to his, every glance stolen in his direction. His voice rose above the hum, rich with arrogance, dripping with cruelty. He recounted a tale of humiliating a valet who had mistaken his car for another. His words laced with disdain, his friends roared with laughter, the sound shallow, sycophantic. Elena refilled glasses at the edge of his table, her hands steady but her chest tightening. She had seen men like him, who delighted in reminding the world of its hierarchies. Cassandra's gaze swept lazily across the room, landing briefly on Elena. At first it was nothing, a flicker of curiosity, but then it lingered, sharpened, narrowed. For a moment, Elena's breath caught. It was not recognition, at least not yet. But something stirred in Cassandra's eyes, as if Elena were a memory fighting to the surface. Elena quickly looked away, heart pounding, retreating to the safety of the periphery. But the room offered no escape. Their manager spotted her, hissed her name, and ordered her back to the main table. With a sigh of resignation, Elena carried a fresh bottle of champagne into the lion's den. Dorian was in the middle of another cruel anecdote, his words punctuated by smug laughter. Elena leaned in, murmuring as she reached for his glass. Cassandra turned her head then, really looking, and her carefully composed mask faltered. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and the color drained from her face. "My God," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the noise. Dorian's story broke off mid-sentence. "What is it, darling?" he asked, irritation flaring. Cassandra didn't answer him. Her eyes locked on Elena like a spotlight, disbelief mingling with accusation. "I know you." Elena froze, the champagne bottle suddenly heavy in her grip. Her mind raced, searching for escape, denial, anything. Cassandra's voice grew stronger, insistent. "You're Elena Cruz." The words cut through the room, sharp and shocking. A murmur rippled through the guests. Dorian's lips curled into a predatory smile, sensing opportunity. Cassandra leaned forward, her face pale but her eyes burning. "We studied at Juilliard together," she said, her voice trembling with something that might have been guilt or envy. "She was a prodigy, the best of us." Whispers spread like fire, curiosity sharpening into fascination. The invisible waitress had been dragged into the light. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears, humiliation coiling like a snake in her chest. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the shadows, but there was no escape. Dorian's smile widened, his voice carrying across the room. "A prodigy," he drawled. "A piano prodigy serving me champagne. How the mighty have fallen." He laughed, the sound cruel and sharp, and the crowd laughed with him, eager to be part of his theater. Elena lowered her gaze, her voice a whisper. "My life changed. Her parents died," Cassandra said softly, almost as if to shield her. But Dorian waved it away, uninterested. Tragedy bored him. What mattered was spectacle, and he had just found his evening's entertainment. There, gleaming under a spotlight in the corner of the room, stood a magnificent Fazioli grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the chandeliers above, its presence both regal and ominous. Dorian gestured toward it with a flourish, his voice booming like an MC. "Well then, ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a treat tonight." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. All eyes turned to Elena. The ghost had been summoned, and the predator was ready to watch her break. The laughter died into a hush as Dorian Blackwell rose from his seat, tapping his glass with a silver knife, commanding silence with the same ease a conductor summons an orchestra. All conversation stopped, eyes shifting toward him and then to Elena, who stood frozen with the champagne bottle. The polished floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the walls of the glittering restaurant closing in with every heartbeat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dorian announced, his voice thick with theatrical delight, "it appears we are in the presence of a hidden treasure. Elena Cruz, once the darling of Juilliard, a prodigy no less, now serves us drinks. Life does compose its ironies well." His smirk deepened as the crowd chuckled nervously. Elena's stomach turned to ice. Cassandra sat rigid beside him, her face pale, her fingers tightening on the stem of her glass. Her voice was low, meant for him alone, but the words carried. "Dorian, don't." He ignored her, his predator's gaze fixed on Elena. "A prodigy should never waste away in obscurity," he said, gesturing toward the grand piano gleaming in the corner beneath its spotlight. "And tonight, we will hear what once made her the pride of the conservatory. A private concert, for us alone." A ripple of excitement threaded through the guests. Heads turned, whispers rose. Some leaned forward with anticipation, others with pity, a few with disdainful curiosity. They weren't just guests anymore. They were an audience waiting for the curtain to rise on someone else's humiliation. Elena shook her head, her voice small but steady. "No, I can't." Dorian chuckled, his eyes glinting. "Oh, come now. A little Chopin, perhaps. A brief piece to earn your tip. Surely your fingers still remember." The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena's breath came short, her throat tight. She looked toward the exit, but Maria, her manager, stood there stiff as stone, torn between loyalty to her staff and terror of offending the man who could ruin them with a single phone call. "I said no," Elena repeated, her voice trembling but firm. The crowd stirred uneasily. It wasn't often that someone defied Dorian Blackwell. His jaw tightened, but his smile remained fixed. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the problem is incentive." He slid a hand into his jacket and produced a thick leather wallet, embossed with his initials. He drew a stack of crisp $100 bills bound by a golden clip from it. $1,000, he said, fanning them out, the bills catching the light. Play a single song, and it's yours. That is, I believe, more than you make in a week? The laughter that followed was thin and cruel. Elena's hands clenched around the neck of the champagne bottle. The money shimmered in her vision, not as bills but as rent, groceries, and Leo's paints and brushes. But she shook her head. No, not for this. Dorian's grin widened. He peeled off more bills with a deliberate slowness, savoring the humiliation. 5,000, he said, placing them on the table beside his untouched glass of champagne. 5 minutes of your time for $5,000. I think you'll find that generous. Gasps scattered through the crowd. $5,000. The number pounded in her ears. It was half of what she needed for Leo's summer program, half of the dream slipping through her fingers. For one breathless instant, her resolve wavered. She saw Leo's face, his eyes lit with hope when the acceptance letter arrived. Her chest ached with longing. But then she saw Dorian's expression. It wasn't an offer, it was a leash. He wanted to own her talent, pain, and dignity and parade them as his evening's entertainment. This wasn't generosity, it was degradation. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. My answer is no. The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Dorian's smirk faltered, then hardened into something colder. His voice dropped into a chilling register. Is that so? His eyes flicked to Cassandra, who sat rigid, her face pale with a complicated storm of emotions. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he asked, "Tell me, Cassandra, this tragedy of hers, was there a brother? A sibling, perhaps?" Cassandra's face drained further. "Dorian, don't," she whispered, but he pressed on. "She has a younger brother," Cassandra finally admitted, her voice breaking. "His name is Lucas." The predator's smile returned, sharper now. "Ah, a brother," Dorian said, as if tasting the word. "A young man with ambitions, I presume, schools to attend, dreams to fund. Dreams that cost money far beyond the reach of a waitress's salary." Elena's chest tightened. He had found the fracture in her armor. Dorian plucked the 5,000 from the table, tossed it aside, and pulled the entire stack of bills from his wallet. He didn't bother counting. He let them fall onto the table in a thick, obscene pile. $10,000, he said, his voice soft but cutting through the room like a knife. "Exactly the sum you need, I suspect. All yours, right now. One song, anything you like." The room went utterly silent. Every guest understood the stakes. This was no longer a spectacle of arrogance. It had become a brutal test of her soul. Elena looked at the money, her heart in a storm. She saw Leo's acceptance letter, his sketches covering their apartment walls, the brightness in his eyes dimming with each bill she couldn't pay. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her, saw Dorian's cruel smirk, Cassandra's stricken face, Maria's pale fear. Her hands trembled, her chest heaved, and a single tear traced down her cheek. Slowly, she unclenched her fists and lifted her chin. Her gaze met Dorian's, steady and unflinching. "Fine," she said at last, her voice hollow yet carrying the weight of a vow. "I'll play." The words left Elena's lips like stones dropped into a well, and the ripples spread instantly across the glittering room. Gasps, whispers, and the sharp intake of breath from those who realized they were about to witness something raw and unrepeatable. Dorian Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his smirk triumphant, his eyes gleaming maliciously. The game had already been won for him, and to the crowd, the night had shifted from a party to a spectacle. Elena set the champagne bottle down on a passing tray, her fingers stiff and numb, her arms heavy as though weighed by invisible chains. The room tilted, not from alcohol, but from the crushing reality of what she had just agreed to. $10,000, the exact number that had haunted her dreams, whispered in her anxieties, carved itself into every sleepless night. For Lucas, her younger brother, she would cross the threshold she had sworn never to approach again. The grand piano stood across the room, its polished black surface reflecting the chandeliers above, like a dark pool of judgment. It was not merely an instrument, it was a monument to the life she had lost, the years she had spent burying the girl who once lived through melody and rhythm. Every step toward it was a confrontation with ghosts she had fled for 6 long years. The guests parted instinctively as she began her walk, their eyes burning into her back, their whispers buzzing like insects. Some anticipated a fumbling disaster, others a faint echo of former brilliance. None expected resurrection. Her heels sank into the plush carpet, muffling her footsteps, yet each step felt like a drumbeat, echoing the pounding of her heart. Memories surged with every stride. She saw her father's hands guiding hers on ivory keys when she was 4. She heard her mother's voice whispering encouragement before her first recital. She remembered the warm light of the house in upstate New York, the sound of laughter, the smell of lemon oil on polished wood. Then the flash of headlights, the scream of tires, the suffocating silence that followed. The piano had become a tombstone, the keys a field of landmines. Her legs trembled, but she did not falter. The humiliation Dorian sought had ignited something deeper, something primal. She thought of Lucas, the sketchbook scattered across his bed, and his quiet determination not to burden her with his dreams. She thought of the acceptance letter lying on their kitchen table, a promise of a future that seemed forever out of reach. The cruelty of the universe had handed her a poisoned chalice, and she would drink it, not for herself, but for him. The room grew impossibly quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Dorian's voice cut through, mocking and sharp. "Take your time, Elena. After all, this may be your one encore." Laughter rippled through a few of his sycophants, but the charged silence quickly swallowed it. They even wanted to see what would happen next. She reached the piano. The Fazioli F278 glowed beneath its spotlight, a gleaming beast waiting to consume her. Its presence was almost unbearable, the polished lid reflecting her pale face like a distorted mask. She pulled out the bench, the simple scrape of wood against carpet echoing far louder than it should have. She sat, adjusting her posture out of a muscle memory that had not been used in years. Her waitress uniform suddenly felt absurd in the face of such magnificence. The black apron across her lap was a scarlet letter, symbolizing how far she had fallen. Her hands, calloused from trays and knives, rested in her lap, trembling so badly she had to clench them into fists. The audience tittered softly, waiting for the spectacle of failure. Dorian crossed his arms, a smirk curling into a sneer. "Any decade now, Cruz," he called, his tone dripping with derision. Elena closed her eyes. The room's noise, the weight of their stares, the crushing pressure of expectation faded into the background. In the silence behind her eyelids, she saw it again. The flashing red and blue lights, the hospital waiting room, the funeral lilies, the dust sheet she had thrown over the Steinway as if burying her parents all over again. The grief was a stone in her chest, cold and immovable. Her fingers hovered above the keys, cool and smooth like polished bone. Her mind was blank for a moment. 6 years of silence building walls around her memory. She couldn't recall a single note, not even the simplest melody. Panic clawed at her throat. Dorian's sharp and cruel laughter filled the edges of her mind. This was it. This was the humiliation he wanted. Then she thought of Lucas, his face, his eyes, how he looked at her as if she were still capable of miracles. She remembered the night he told her he would abandon his dream so she wouldn't have to carry the weight alone. She remembered how fiercely she had said no, how she had promised she would find a way. That love, that vow, crashed through the fortress of her trauma. She drew in a deep, shuddering breath. Her hands, no longer fists, rose above the keys. She wasn't thinking of Dorian, the guests, or the money piled on the table. She thought of Lucas, their parents, and the music that once defined her. And then, with 6 years of silence behind her, Elena pressed the keys. The first chord cracked through the silence like a lightning strike. It was not tentative, not hesitant, but a declaration of war. Once frozen by fear, Elena's hands found themselves moving with a ferocity that astonished even her. The opening measures of Chopin's Etude in C minor exploded from the piano, filling the air with a storm of sound so raw and forceful that the crystal chandeliers above seemed to vibrate in sympathy. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A champagne flute slipped from someone's grasp, shattering on the marble floor. But no one turned their head. Their eyes were locked on the young woman in the plain black uniform, whose body had become a vessel for 6 years of grief, rage, and love. Sitting at the center of his kingdom, Dorian Blackwell leaned forward, the smirk wiped from his face, his jaw slack in disbelief. This was not the humiliation he had orchestrated. This was something far more dangerous. The music consumed Elena's entire being. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, her head tilted back as though the melody was pulling her upright. Her fingers, calloused from carrying plates and glasses, now flew across the keys with a precision and speed that defied logic. It was as though her body remembered what her mind had tried so hard to forget. Every note poured out of her not as a performance, but as an exorcism. The music told her story without words. It carried the chaos of screeching tires and shattered glass. It carried the suffocating weight of funerals and the sterile smell of hospital corridors. It took the nights she had worked double shifts, her feet aching, her body exhausted, to keep the lights on. And beneath it all, woven into every crescendo and every desperate descent of her hands, was the love for Lucas, the boy who had kept her alive when she wanted to give up. The boy whose dreams she refused to let die. The crowd was transfixed. Manhattan's elite, hardened by wealth and power, felt their defenses crumble under the weight of her truth. The cynical sneers and polite masks vanished, replaced by something pure and primal: wonder. Some clutched their chests. Others leaned forward as though afraid to miss a single note. The sound storm swept through the room, stripping away the arrogance and cruelty that had filled it minutes before. At the back of the room, Professor Adrian Kessler, a distinguished figure with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, rose slowly to his feet. He had been invited reluctantly, a favor to an old friend, expecting nothing more than another night of shallow indulgence. But as Elena played, he recognized her instantly. The prodigy who had once captivated his lectures, the girl who had vanished without explanation. Tears glistened in his eyes as he listened. This was not the brilliance of a polished performer. This was brilliance forged in fire, tempered by suffering, transformed into something transcendent. Elena's eyes remained closed. She did not need to see the crowd or Dorian's mocking face. She was not playing for them. She was playing for the parents she lost, for the brother she fought for the girl she once had been and the woman she was becoming again. Her fingers attacked the keys, then caressed them, the storm shifting between fury and fragile beauty. The piano became her battlefield and her sanctuary. The climax built like a tidal wave, each phrase crashing harder than the last until it seemed the glass windows of the skyscraper might shatter from the sheer force. And then, with a final cascade of chords, it ended. One last resounding strike that hung in the air, vibrating with the weight of everything she had poured into it. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the room had ever known. It was not absence but presence, heavy, sacred, alive. Elena's chest heaved, sweat dampening her brow. Her hands fell into her lap, trembling not from fear but from release. She slowly opened her eyes and saw the room before her, a sea of stunned faces, eyes wide, mouths open. People who had expected a spectacle of failure and witnessed a resurrection. And then, Adrian Kessler began to clap from the back of the room. The sound was deliberate, decisive, each strike of his palms echoing like a verdict. One by one, others joined him. The applause swelled, not the polite patter of high society, but a roar, a thunderous ovation that filled the hall with something greater than admiration. It was reverence. Elena stared at her hands. They were hers again. The fortress of silence was gone. She was free. The ovation roared on, crashing like waves against the marble walls, drowning out the clinking of glasses and the hum of electricity in the chandelier lights. Elena sat still for a moment longer, her fingers curled in her lap, her chest rising and falling as though she had just survived a battle. In truth, she had. When she finally rose from the piano bench, her body felt lighter and heavier, as if a weight had been lifted and replaced by something vast and uncontainable. Across the room, Dorian Blackwell sat frozen in his chair, his face an ugly mask of disbelief. He had invited humiliation for her, but it turned back on him, magnified and unstoppable. The storm she had unleashed had not just drowned out his cruelty, it had exposed him. His guests, once eager sycophants, no longer looked at him with awe or envy. They looked at him with contempt. Standing tall near the piano, Professor Adrian Kessler was still clapping, his eyes never leaving Elena. With every beat of his palms, his approval reverberated through the crowd, shifting the balance of power. His words were sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore when they finally came. "That was not entertainment," he declared, his voice ringing with command. "That was a testament to survival, to genius tempered by grief, to art at its purest form." He turned his piercing gaze directly on Dorian. "And yet you would reduce it to a parlor trick, a wager of humiliation, an act of cruelty dressed in finery. Shame on you." The words hit harder than Elena's chords. A ripple went through the audience, a murmur of agreement swelling into something more dangerous: judgment. Dorian's skin flushed red, his jaw tightening, but he could not summon the usual smirk or muster his trademark defiance. His vault had just been emptied in a room where reputation was currency. Beatrice Langford, his fiancée, stood beside him, her silver gown shimmering as though mocking his collapse. She looked at Elena not with hatred now, but with something raw: regret, awe, even respect. For years she had buried her envy beneath layers of brittle elegance, but now it broke through, exposing her. With trembling hands, she reached for the thick wad of bills Dorian had flung onto the table. The room hushed, watching. Beatrice held the money for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she turned to Dorian, her voice sharp and cold. "You are a small, pathetic man." She hurled the bills into his face with a single flick of her wrist. The crisp notes fluttered down like grotesque confetti, sticking to his tailored suit, littering the polished floor at his feet. Gasps erupted, followed by silence so taut it felt ready to snap. Dorian's eyes widened, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came. He had been stripped bare, not by Elena's defiance alone, but by the betrayal of the woman who had once stood as his prized ornament. "We're finished," Beatrice said, her voice steady now, carrying easily over the stunned audience. She stepped away from him, her back straight, her head held high, and for the first time that night, her beauty was not brittle but fierce. She gave Elena a long, searching look full of contradictions, shame mingling with admiration. And then she walked out, leaving the glittering party and its fallen master behind. The applause, which had faded into murmurs during the confrontation, reignited. This time, it was not just for Elena's music, but for the truth laid bare. The masquerade of power and cruelty that Dorian had cultivated was shattered, and the pieces lay scattered at his feet, like the bills he could not buy back his dignity with. Elena moved away from the piano, her steps measured, her spine unyielding. She did not walk toward the exit. Instead, she walked toward Dorian. The crowd parted instinctively, the air heavy with anticipation. She stopped directly before him, close enough to see the sweat on his brow and the fury in his trembling jaw. Her eyes, no longer fearful, burned with calm fire. She said, "My music is not for sale," her voice quiet but resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "And it is certainly not for your amusement." The words rang like a final chord, sharp and undeniable. Dorian flinched as if struck, his empire of arrogance collapsing in the silence that followed. Elena turned her back on him, leaving him with the scattered bills, the sneering stares of his peers, and the hollow echo of his defeat. The crowd watched her go, not as a waitress fading into anonymity, but as a force reborn. In that moment, Elena was no longer invisible, she was unforgettable. The night air outside the towering glass fortress of the Blackwell Tower struck Elena like a sudden baptism. It was sharp with the scent of rain on pavement and the exhaust of idling limousines waiting along the curb. She pulled her shawl tighter, not for warmth, but as if to hold herself together after what had just transpired. Inside, she had faced the ghosts of her past, the cruelty of the present, and the weight of the future. Outside, the city pulsed on, indifferent and relentless. She walked quickly, heels clicking on wet concrete, as though the shadows of the ballroom might still chase her. The applause still echoed faintly in her ears, not the polite acknowledgement of wealthy patrons, but the kind that carried awe, disbelief, and something close to reverence. It was surreal, like waking from a fever dream and finding the world changed. On the subway platform, she stood among commuters who had no idea she had just shattered a tyrant and reclaimed a piece of herself. To them, she was only another tired woman clutching her purse too tightly. She almost laughed at its absurdity. Hours earlier, she had been a ghost in a waitress uniform. Then, in a single storm of music, she had become something else entirely, though she had no word for it yet. The silence was a bomb when she finally pushed open the creaking door of the apartment she shared with Gabriel. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant honk of horns outside felt familiar, grounding. Gabriel was asleep on the couch, textbooks splayed across his chest, a pencil still between his fingers. His lanky frame seemed too fragile for the weight of the world he carried in his drawings, and too young for the responsibility he silently bore beside her. Elena stood watching him, her heart aching with love and guilt. She crept, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, then sat down at their scarred kitchen table. The envelope from the Rhode Island School of Design still lay there, mocking her with its promise and its price. $10,000. The number had stalked her thoughts like a predator, and tonight it had been placed in front of her like bait on a gilded hook. She closed her eyes, remembering the feel of the bills fanned in Dorian's hand, and the gleam when he realized he had cornered her. He had not wanted her music. He had wished to own her shame. Yet, in defying him, she had bought something no money could secure: freedom. Still, the problem remained. Gabriel's dream was balanced on a precipice, and the deadline loomed like a storm cloud. Her phone buzzed softly on the table, startling her. A number she did not recognize appeared on the screen. For a moment, she hesitated, suspicion prickling her spine. Then she answered, her voice low. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was warm, measured, with the faintest trace of an Eastern European cadence. "Elena, is it truly you? This is Adrian Kessler." Her breath caught. Professor Kessler. She had not expected to hear from him again. Not so soon, not ever in this way. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Tonight, I witnessed something extraordinary," he said, his tone heavy and convictional. "What you gave us was not performance, it was a revelation. I knew the child prodigy years ago, but tonight I saw the artist forged in fire. I cannot let that vanish again into shadows." Her throat tightened. She whispered, "I thought I had lost it." "You thought wrong," he replied, gentle but firm. "I am now head of the piano department at Juilliard. There is an opening for a graduate assistantship. It comes with a full scholarship for your master's degree. No audition. What I heard tonight was all the audition you will ever need." Tears pricked her eyes. A scholarship, a master's degree, a chance to step back into the light she had abandoned 6 years ago. It was too much, too impossible, like a dream spoken aloud. "Professor, I don't know what to say." "Say you will think about it," he urged. "But do not think for too long. Talent like yours must not wither in darkness. It belongs in the light, where others may be guided by it." When the call ended, she sat staring at the darkened screen, her reflection faint in the glass. For the first time in years, hope surged in her chest so fierce it was almost painful. Yet even as it bloomed, the shadow of reality crept in. The offer was miraculous, but it did not erase the pressing weight of Gabriel's tuition deposit. The miracle was for her, but the boy sleeping in the next room still needed his. She rose, moving to the living room. The sheet still covered the old Steinway, its hulking outline a monument to her silence. For years, she had avoided it like a tomb. Tonight, though, it no longer felt like a gravestone. It felt like a beginning. She touched the fabric, her fingers lingering as though to promise soon. The city outside roared on, uncaring of the battles won or lost within its walls. But Elena knew something had shifted. She was not the same woman who had walked into Blackwell Tower invisible and afraid. She was new, reborn from the humiliation meant to destroy her. Tomorrow there would be questions. Tomorrow there would be obstacles. But tonight, in the fragile quiet of her apartment, there was only the aftermath of silence and the faint, trembling promise of music waiting to be played again. 2 days passed, and the city had already spun Elena's story into something larger than life. Whispers traveled through Manhattan's social arteries like wildfire, each retelling more dramatic than the last. The waitress who defied Dorian Blackwell, the prodigy who returned from silence, the storm of Chopin that shattered a party and a reputation in one devastating sweep. For Elena, however, the noise outside mattered little. She was still in her small apartment, staring at the RISD acceptance letter on the table, the same impossible number weighing down her chest. $10,000. The world could spin its tales of triumph and defiance, but reality remained stubbornly immovable. She had quit her job at El Astra. Maria had wept as she accepted the resignation, guilt carved into her features. "I failed you," she had confessed, wringing her hands, but Elena had silenced her with quiet grace. "You were afraid, Maria, we all were, but I can't be invisible anymore." There had been no bitterness in her tone, only certainty. Leaving was not an act of anger, but of liberation. Yet the freedom came with the cruel reminder that she was unemployed, with rent to pay and her brother's dream hanging by a thread. On the third morning, a knock rattled their door. Gabriel, still groggy from sleep, stumbled to open it. A courier in a sharp gray uniform stood outside, holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with embossed lettering. He handed it over with the crisp efficiency of someone who carried important documents daily, but rarely understood their contents. Elena signed without question, though her hands trembled as she closed the door. The envelope was heavy in her grasp, its weight disproportionate to its size. She carried it to the table, Gabriel watching from the couch, curiosity dawning in his dark eyes. With careful fingers, she slid it open. Inside lay a letter on thick, expensive stationery, and a cashier's check beneath it. Her breath caught as her eyes scanned the words. "Miss Cruz," the letter began, "this correspondence informs you that Gabriel Cruz has established an educational trust. The trust has been created by a benefactor who was present at the private event at La Astra on the evening of July 28th. Your artistic integrity and personal strength profoundly moved this individual, who wishes to remain strictly anonymous. Believing such artistry should be nurtured, our client has endowed this trust to cover the full 4-year tuition, room, and board for Gabriel Cruz at the Rhode Island School of Design, contingent upon his acceptance into their undergraduate program. I am attaching a cashier's check for $10,000 made payable to RISD to cover the deposit for the summer program. All further tuition payments will be handled directly through our firm. We extend our best wishes to you and your brother." Elena's vision blurred as she read the words repeatedly, unable to believe them. Her hand closed around the check, the inked numbers glowing like a beacon in her palm. $10,000, the exact sum, the very amount Dorian had taunted her with, was offered as the price of her soul. Now it had returned, not as a weapon, but as a gift, transformed by grace into salvation. Gabriel leaned forward, his face pale with awe. "Elena, how is this possible?" She looked at him, her lips trembling into a smile that felt fragile, almost unreal. "I told you I'd figure it out," she whispered. They sat silently for a long moment, the letter spread across the table, the check resting between them like a talisman. Elena thought of the anonymous benefactor, someone in that glittering room who had watched her humiliation and triumph, who had chosen not to applaud from the crowd's safety, but to act in secret. Perhaps it was Kessler, maybe it was a stranger, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Gabriel's future was secure. His dream was no longer a fragile hope, but a living path. That evening, when Gabriel returned from school, he found Elena standing in the living room with the dust sheet pulled from the Steinway. The piano gleamed in the fading light, no longer a tomb, but a promise. She sat at the bench, her posture perfect, her hands hovering above the keys. He froze in the doorway, his sketchbook clutched to his chest, watching her with wide, reverent eyes. And then she began to play. Not the furious storm of Chopin that had erupted from her days earlier, but the soft, luminous strains of Debussy's Clair de Lune. The melody unfurled like moonlight breaking through clouds, delicate, tender, and full of hope. It filled the small apartment with something holy, a balm against years of silence and grief. Gabriel sank to the floor, opening his sketchbook with trembling hands. His pencils moved swiftly, capturing her profile in the half-light, the curve of her back, the serenity in her expression as music once again became her language. They were no longer surviving in silence for the first time in years. They were creating together, piano and canvas, sound and shadow, weaving their lives into a duet neither tragedy nor cruelty could destroy. In that moment, Elena understood. She had not simply reclaimed her music, she had reclaimed herself. And Gabriel, with charcoal-stained fingers and eyes alight with wonder, was no longer just her responsibility. He was her partner in the art of survival, the proof that beauty could be reborn even in the deepest shadows. The morning light spilled across the apartment floor, golden and insistent, as though the city itself knew something had changed. Elena woke not with the heaviness that had anchored her for years, but with a clarity that startled her. The weight she had carried since her parents' accident, the suffocating silence, the guilt, the endless survival, felt lighter, if not gone entirely. There was music in her veins again, soft and persistent, like a heartbeat she had tried to ignore. She brewed coffee, her movements calm, deliberate. Gabriel shuffled out of his room, hair sticking up, eyes bleary, clutching his sketchbook even at breakfast. He paused at the sight of the Steinway uncovered, bathed in morning light. It looked different now, no longer a monument to grief, but a companion waiting patiently. He glanced at his sister, a tentative smile tugging at his lips. "You played last night. I heard it in my dreams." Elena returned his smile, small but steady. "I did, and I'll keep playing." Her phone buzzed on the table, its screen flashing an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, her heart kicking into a faster rhythm. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Elena, this is Adrian Kessler." She nearly dropped the mug in her hand. "Professor," she breathed, unable to mask the tremor in her voice. "I hope I did not disturb you," he said warmly. "I am calling you not as a professor, but as someone who has witnessed what you are. What you gave us that night cannot be ignored. It must not vanish again into shadows." Elena swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice thin. 6 years is a long time. My hands." Kessler interrupted gently. "Your hands are exactly as they should be. They carry scars of work, of struggle, of life. That is what makes them powerful. The technique can be polished. What you have cannot be taught. It is a raw, profound truth." His words pressed against the walls she had built inside herself. He continued, more deliberate now. "I am offering you a place at Juilliard, a graduate assistantship. Full scholarship, complete support. You will teach. You will perform. You will return to the world you were destined for." The words stunned her into silence. A scholarship, Juilliard, the place she had once dreamed of, the place that had slipped from her fingers like sand. It was there again, as if time had looped back to give her another chance. Gabriel watched from across the table, his eyes wide, his hands tightening around his sketchbook. She covered the mouthpiece and whispered, "It's Juilliard. They want me back." His face broke into a smile so radiant it nearly undid her. "What are you waiting for? Say yes!" But Elena hesitated. Her mind was a battlefield of hope and fear. To return meant exposing herself again, not just to music, but to memories. It meant standing on stages, risking failure, facing the expectations of a world that had once proclaimed her prodigy. What if the silence returned? What if the storm she unleashed at La Ostra was a fluke, a final spark before extinguishment? As, if sensing her hesitation, Kessler's voice softened. "I will not pressure you, Elena, but I will tell you this. What I saw in that room was not a performance. It was survival transfigured into art. The world needs that. Your students will need that. And you, perhaps most of all, need it too." When the call ended, she sat, motionless, the silence between her and Gabriel thick with possibility. He leaned forward, eyes fierce. "You can't say no, Elena. This is yours. You gave me my chance with Rizd. You fought for me. Now it's my turn to fight for you." The conviction in his voice struck her harder than anything Kessler had said. He was right. She had clawed against despair for him, refusing to let his dream be swallowed by the same shadows that had consumed hers. Could she deny herself the same salvation? Later that day, Elena walked through the city with a new posture. The skyscrapers no longer loomed over her as threats, but stood as silent witnesses. She reached the Juilliard campus, her steps slow, reverent. The building rose before her, unchanged yet entirely new, its doors gleaming in the afternoon light. She stood there for a long time, remembering the girl who had once walked these halls, brimming with talent and unscarred by tragedy. That girl was gone, but in her place stood a woman forged in grief, tempered by survival, and reborn through defiance. She did not need to be who she was before. She only needed to be who she was now. With a steadying breath, Elena pushed open the door. The world of music rushed back to meet her, not as a ghost of the past, but as a living, breathing future. A door once closed had reopened, and she was ready to walk through it. The first rehearsal room Elena stepped into smelled faintly of rosin, old wood, and ambition. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of music stands and the scuffed floorboards that bore the marks of countless hours of practice. She paused in the doorway, her heart hammering, as if crossing the threshold might collapse the fragile miracle she had been given. But the room did not reject her. It welcomed her with silence, waiting. Adrian Kessler stood at the piano near the center, his silver hair glinting like a crown in the light. He looked up from the sheet music before him, his eyes warm but sharp with expectation. "Elena," he said, as though her presence was not astonishing, as though she had never left. His voice held the calm certainty of someone who had always known she would return. She crossed the room, every step a reminder of the years she had lost. When she sat at the piano bench, the weight of memory pressed down. She saw herself at 16, a girl ablaze with confidence, praised by critics, courted by professors. And then she saw herself now, older, scarred, her hands calloused, not by etudes but trays and knives. She placed her fingers on the keys. They trembled. "Play," Kessler said softly. "Do not think. Do not fear. Just listen." She closed her eyes and pressed down. The first notes came halting, fragile, like a bird testing broken wings. But then the sound grew, warmed, steadied. The years of silence had not destroyed her. They had transformed her. The music that poured out was no longer the flawless precision of youth. It was deeper, heavier, saturated with experience. Each phrase carried the weight of loss and the stubborn strength of survival. Kessler listened, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes damp. When she finished, he did not applaud. Instead, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "That," he said, "is why you belong here. Not because you were once a prodigy, but because you are now an artist." The words struck her like a benediction. For the first time she felt she was not merely clawing her way back to what she had been. She was stepping into something new, something more profound. Her days quickly filled with a rhythm she had long forgotten. Morning lectures, afternoons mentoring young undergraduates, evenings spent in practice rooms where the glow of desk lamps turned scores into illuminated manuscripts. She guided students who looked at her with the wide eyes she once carried, who believed technique was everything. She told them gently that technique was the skeleton, but life was the flesh, grief the marrow, and love the pulse. At night she returned home to Gabriel, who now spent hours sketching at the dining table, his acceptance to RISD no longer a dream, but a certainty secured by the anonymous benefactor. Their apartment, once heavy with despair, buzzed with energy. Piano and pencil, melody and line, they worked side by side in silence that was no longer empty but full of possibility. Yet the weight of her new dawn pressed hard. With opportunity came fear. The whispers about her had not stopped. Some in the city praised her as a phoenix rising from the ashes. Others dismissed her as a curiosity, a scandalous story spun into legend. Dorian Blackwell's fall had become a headline, and with it, her defiance had been turned into a myth. She carried the knowledge that every performance would be judged not against ordinary standards, but against the storm she had unleashed at Lastra. Could she live up to that moment again? One evening, as she practiced alone in a dim rehearsal hall, the question broke her concentration. Her fingers faltered, and the melody collapsed into discord. She pressed her hands against the keys, trembling. What if the storm had been a singular miracle, unrepeatable? What if she had stepped back into the light only to fail? She did not hear Gabriel enter until his voice broke the silence. He said, "You're overthinking." Standing in the doorway with his sketchbook under his arm, "You don't need to prove anything, you need to play." She turned toward him, tears stinging her eyes. "And if I can't? Then you'll draw it for me," he said with a crooked smile, lifting his sketchbook. "And I'll remind you, you're not just a pianist, Elena, you're my sister. That's more important than any stage." His words anchored her. She realized that the storm at Lastra had not been born from pressure or expectation. It had been born from love, from the unbreakable bond between them. That bond had not weakened, it had only grown stronger. She returned to the keys, her hands steadier, her heart lighter. The weight of a new dawn was heavy, yes, but it was also luminous. For the first time in years, she felt not the shadow of what she had lost, but the promise of what she still had to give. The night of her first public recital arrived like the slow drawing of a bow across strings, tense and inevitable. The hall was smaller than the grand stages of her past, but its intimacy made every velvet seat and gilded sconce feel like the eyes of judgment itself. The program listed her name, Elena Cruz, without the titles or accolades that had once accompanied it. To most, she was a curiosity, a fallen prodigy reborn through scandal. To herself, she was still learning to believe she belonged here. Backstage, her hands hovered over the keys of an upright piano as she warmed up. They no longer trembled as they had at Lastra, but carried a different weight. Every scar, every callus, every line etched by survival made them stronger. She closed her eyes and listened to the audience's murmur beyond the curtain. Among them, she knew sat Adrian Kessler, steadfast and watchful, his faith in her unshakable. Near the front was Gabriel, sketchbook in his lap, ready to capture her in the only way he knew how: line, shadow, and light. When the stagehand signaled, she rose and walked out beneath the warm blaze of spotlights. The applause that greeted her was polite, hesitant, filled with curiosity more than reverence. She bowed, then sat at the gleaming Steinway Grand. For a long moment, she rested her hands in her lap and breathed, steadying herself against the hum of expectation. She began, not with Chopin, not with the furious storm that had reclaimed her at Lastra, but with something gentler, more deliberate. The opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune floated into the hall, delicate as moonlight on water. Each phrase shimmered with tenderness, a hymn to healing, to the resilience that had carried her this far. The audience leaned forward, drawn not by spectacle but by sincerity. This was not a performance for applause. It was a confession in sound. As the piece unfolded, Elena felt the hall transform. The silence between notes grew thick and reverent, which only comes when hearts are listening, not just ears. She could feel the connection weaving between her and the strangers in the seats, fragile yet undeniable. And when the last notes dissolved into air, the pause before applause stretched long and sacred. Then the room erupted, not with politeness but with genuine wonder. She moved through the program with a confidence that grew with each piece. Schumann, Rachmaninoff, a contemporary work dedicated to loss and renewal. But it was the final piece, Chopin's revolutionary etude, brought the evening to its height. This time, it was not born from humiliation or defiance. It was born from choice. Her hands flew across the keys, summoning the storm not as a weapon but as an offering, a testament to the journey from silence to sound, from shadow to light. The ovation that followed shook the walls. People rose, some shouting her name, others clapping until their hands reddened. She stood, bowed, and caught sight of Gabriel. He was already sketching furiously, his eyes bright, his lips curved in a smile that spoke volumes. He wasn't just proud, he was inspired. Backstage after the performance, Kessler approached her, his expression unreadable, until he finally spoke. "You are ready," he said, "not just for Juilliard, not just for stages, but for the world. Your music will not only return, it will change those who hear it." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she believed him. Later that night, Gabriel spread his sketches across the table at home. They showed her not as a waitress, not as a broken prodigy, but as a woman alive with fire and grace, every line capturing the strength he had always seen in her. She traced the drawings with her fingers, tears pricking her eyes. "You see me better than I see myself," she whispered. He shook his head, smiling. "No, I draw what's already there." As the city slept, Elena returned to the Steinway. She sat with Gabriel nearby, sketching in the quiet, and began to play again. Not for an audience or survival, but for the joy of it. The music filled their small apartment, intertwining with the scratch of a pencil on paper. It was no longer a solo, it was a duet. The world outside remained harsh, filled with men like Dorian Blackwell and unseen challenges. But beneath the soft glow of a single lamp, Elena and Gabriel carved out a sanctuary of art and love within those walls. Their duet was a promise. No matter how dark the silence, music and creation would always return. Elena lifted her eyes from the keys, watching her brother's hand swiftly across the page. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but they had each other tonight, which was enough. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to play into existence, note by note, line by line, a duet of tomorrow that would never be silenced again.